the Luciferian Soviet, which is generated by the division of the Confederacy having to fracture in order to gain progress against the Americans, as it was systemically losing ground. First, in losing the Civil War, and second, all of the separate but equal mantras from its offspring, and the mechanism of it having systemically lost progress required its evolution, required the new parasite, which is far more insidious. At which point, the reproduction of old magics, such as the function of Leninist communism for the mass murdering psychopaths to be bred and reproduce for the functional purpose of necessary force for the revolution, until there is no purpose for the delusion anymore. And then the reason is because of the acts. This generates the functional understanding that communists trade people, not money, as they are insufferably incompetent from the drive to power without the rational calculations of the management of the resources in the first place. They are exclusively in the function of the white supremacists, exclusively to the white supremacist KKK function of the surveillance agents engaged in the terrorist operations by defrauding the government, such as is normal in California by its pseudo policies of customs without reason, which gives exceptions and does not treat the same offense in the same way, as the act of conducting the offense has to be done in the exact same way as it was when it was recognized and punished, as they are systematically rolling back law and enforcing anarchy and increasing the treacheries, which then becomes the subject of how to defraud the government as a function of disillusionment of due process, which then generates their acts of entrapment schemes through secret technologies and tricks, which the courts are defrauded as a matter of custom, with the willing intention of its double agent judges, who know that the thing that they're processing is fraud, and thus there is no due process, which generates the function of the Confederate insurrection after it has overthrown the state to engage in the grabbing of citizens from other states as an extension of the Confederate policy of being able to engage in slavery and the ability to force other states to subjugate themselves against their states' rights for the states' rights of the slave owners outside of the jurisdiction, which is the nullification of the entire construct of jurisdiction, as their position is centrally focused on insanity or the disillusionment of definitions. As the anarchist policy goes, the only rule is that there are no rules, and thus the craving to power generates those who take for their own sake, lest a more vibrant community arise and take the majority. They must be brutally repressed by the more brutal will. To this generates the presumption of the communists by the white supremacists and their satanic position concerning their devil worship and their Luciferianism, which generates their wizards of light, which generates their wizards council or a Soviet of Lucifer or the Luciferian Soviet. This then continues to their position of the generation of their secret cloud, which then replaces for the enforcement of their essentially planned economy as they make their hate crimes a normal function or activity to this for the insurrection, to engage in the disillusionment of the general public as an act of war or treason to overthrow the civilian population's capacity to form a republic, at which point there is no popular government, and thus they, having ignored the Constitution, have no rule of law, and thus there is no constitutional republic, and thus there is only the Soviet by the engagement of Confederate hate crimes, as they are a communist anarchical state engaged in the pursuit of insurrection for its own sake, at which point every piece of value that they gained is derived by their consumption as a parasite and their thefts in order to obtain it as a parasite. At that action, you have the complete destruction of every competent aspect of the general community which is subjugated to their illusions, as they are put into a traumatized state by their abusers engaged in psychological warfare, engaged in dark psychology for these malicious abuses to be normalized for the insurrection to take place until there is only the edited Confederate options, at which point it is a question of which Druid leader you would go for, and if there is no concept in the anarcho-communist state of which one you would choose, and there is a violent opposition to each other, there is no rule of law by which to protect you. And in the action of having dissolved it, the anarcho-communists engaged in this religious civil war amongst their Druid leaders. And this is functionally, after having captured every social action, such as the churches, which have prostituted themselves to these activities in order to have been accepted and promoted into the fold of the more violently promoted societies, and their secret societies, having engaged in the position, has sold the position of the pastor into the priesthood of the Druids, at which point they have forfeited their original religion and adopted the Druid religion, by which they are destroying their communities when they, having preached the Druid religion, engaged in the manipulation of the conversion from their religion into the activity of whatever thing the Druids are selling for their religious rituals, which would change on the basis of whatever they're trying to acquire, including the function of having converted the Muslims in the Middle East into the radical versions of themselves, creating the radical Muslim terrorist construct, which is a delusion of the white supremacists, which hyper-radicalizes the hate against the Muslim communities, and thus the Middle Eastern communities, and thus becomes a justification to the racism itself. By accepting from your own incompetence the radicalization of the terrorist hate group, you then become the consumable products, and thus betrayed by the community that built you, and thus destroyed by it, and then consumed from it, as the justification of allying with it becomes the justification of your own demise under that communist system of consuming or eating your radicals. Before the radicals can become dangerous, and thus they have to be radicalized in order to become dangerous against others, but then the radicalization of that danger not turned against the actual core parasite from the groups creating them, have to consume them before that end. And so they, in their deal with the devil, with the groups to be radicalized, create strategic vulnerabilities which they had to accept on purpose, knowing that there are vulnerability, which is the mechanism that often is used for consuming them, at which point they are completely vulnerable to that group until they are eaten from being an expendable piece of trash that can then be thrown away as the husk nothing that they are when they are sucked dry by the parasite. The problem, therefore, is not the existence of the parasite, but those weak-willed, spineless fools who are willing to be radicalized. And even more than that, those weak fools, these spineless, convertible radicals, would in many cases be stopped if those who had the position were not insufferably incompetent and allowed it to happen, and thus the protection of the experts, not being cowards and doing their job correctly, would then normalize the opposition to the radicalization process from the white supremacists, which has normalized the Hitler's Youth and other child abuse magics, and thus the ritual targeting by the female narcissists of children in order to engage in capturing them and converting them into the desired objective creates the normalization process for the radicalization, which then countered by the experts can then be normalized as the immune system defeating the poison from the parasite, which has stopped the immune system before then, which allows it to be consumed, which allows it to be removed, and the community to be saved. Therefore, I fear the cowardice of the party over the malice of the predators. When good men do nothing, when good women do nothing, when they are indifferent in great times of moral turmoil, they then become the actual greatest threat, as the complying with the subjugation to the poison, blocking the immune system. That being compromised is a much greater threat than the parasite. The immune system can consume the parasite. The threat is letting the parasite poison it so that the immune system stops working. When the system stops working, when the sedition becomes a viable strategy, that is when the real damages take hold and consume and discard the community. I believe it was Final Fantasy I. There was a kingdom with a general, and the general was promoted to creating the apocalypse. And the Wizards of Light Council then sent a group of 4 heroes back in time in order to fight him. And those 4 heroes, having gone back in time, were able to become strong enough from the magic in order to defeat him. And the Wizards of Light, having corrupted the general, created the Hegelian dialectic function of the snake eating its own tail. So, having corrupted the general, justified their actions in killing the general, allowed for their communist objective to cut in line from their centrally planned economy from those who do not deserve it, to cut in line to gain advantage above those who do deserve it by that justification with the manipulation of that pretense. And that action is an expression which is happening in the real world right now. Um, when they first, early on, when they targeted David Bowles, this was one of their arguments for the function, which means, by definition, they created a simulation for him to be defamed inside an abuse theater under the control of their communists of Lucifer, which generated the Wizards of Light Council, which then manufactured their capacity to have advanced themselves from unearned gains in the time travel so that they could conduct the sedition and fool those who are most benefited by the existence of the patriarchy into betraying him. And thus the aristocracy is undermined by the very parties that need him, similar to in Reagan's statement that those who are most in need or have the most to lose are often the ones who are the most casual about it. And in that activity, they, in their delusion, accept their own vulnerability for the process of the ritual sacrifices, which generates the pretense of the mass sacrifices, such as in the D&D function of the creation of Vecna, who created a massive desert from the mass collection of people for a mass sacrifice in his ritual conversion into power. And this is functionally what they're doing in real life right now from their Confederate platforms, leveraging government secrets, as many of the advantages, such as being on the Intelligence Oversight Committee um, from Adam Schiff and many of the others, have leveraged the function of their political violence against their own communities in order to form their power, using Lookingglass as a mechanism for the projection of their most viable position of power. They have functionally sent themselves back in time in order to hyper accelerate their own importance so that they could be strong enough to overthrow the society and dismantle its government and assert themselves in their position of nobility against the American Constitution as above the Constitution, having conquered the United States in their acts of treason by their sedition for the functional protection of the damages of the high crimes, which reinforces their position as a conquering noble engaged in the function of spoiling their defeated adversary. These studied magics include the function of mass censorship, which has engaged in the general publics who need the original value do not have access to the information of the original charts of value, which has been redacted. And in that redaction, the edits by the delusional freaks generates the alternate value, at which point everything that they want by their psychopath rapist system, as the movie I Am Number Four perfectly illustrates. The high school kid who is the son of the sheriff actively uses his status in connection to the government to misuse the functions of the government in order to centrally control the sexual options until those who are unwilling break in and submit to their place under his sexual options. And they're doing that en masse. And the blocking of the sexual options and the humiliation rituals generates the pretense of having done that exact ritual exercise, which then is a function of coercion in the light blue helmet Soviet action from the original communist Soviet Russia in the USSR, which, having conquered those groups, engaged in the general threats against people, such as people who were in a romantic relationship who were told that they have to allow the woman to have sex with the light blue helmet wizard, or the guy was going to get abused, then compels the sexual engagement as an act of coercion, as an act of rape, which is then reproduced as the normal standard function of the communist central planned economy and its sexual market as a centrally planned economy under Plato's conspiracy, generating that pretense under the degrees of which part of the ritual they're in is the part that you'll be able to refer to, but that as a standard function becomes the definition of the rape culture. Now, the rape culture having been active inside the military, which is the reason why it's actively trying to promote the function of women joining the military, is the acceleration of the rape culture, of their ability to sell the rape or access to the rape for the reproduction or distribution of their powers, which generates their compliance as a service or amenity laundered in the black market for their compliance and subjugation and happiness to comply with as an exchange of services uh, for the rape and whatever thing that the rape culture needs, at which point their entire access to sex as a collective unit becomes itself rape. Any act of sex inside that is based on the coercion in the first place, which gave them access to it. At which point you would have to destroy the entire system in order to engage in that mechanism. And the complete dismantlement of the surveillance system requires the functional acknowledgement of Congress of its responsibilities to the victims, which includes, at first, the function of those who have been targeted by the sedition so they could be returned to power so the government could return to its obligations, returning the government's responsibilities into action starts to arrest and engage in the disillusionment of the parasite. By the virus no longer working, the mechanism of the immune system continues to go back into normal, which then dissolves the rape culture. At which point the function of the sexual opportunities are only derived by the illusion of the rapists who were in control of the entire arrangement. At which point the act of having sex is a side effect of the rapist. Each time that they have sex is an act of rape, but not by the partner. The partner is a prisoner of war, and the function of themselves is a prisoner of war. And take into the position of taken as the mechanism of their sex trade, where they find girls to engage in having sex with, so they capture them, they chain them up, they drug them out, they exhaust them, and they sell them off for sex. Now, what happens when you have another prisoner of the opposite sex where they're doing the same thing to, and they force them to be together? The function is not them raping each other. The function is rape, but it's not raping each other. They're mutually victims of the abusers who have drugged them out and put them into that situation. Now, the function of their human decency requires them to receive certain advantages, and sex is a part of that. But the existence of the rest of the abuse in order to have manufactured it is the prohibited action of the coercion. And again, one of the key aspects of that rapist scheme is the starvation of the sexual options of both parties until they have been aligned to the contract itself on the schedule from the contracts, at which point the act of having blocked the options becomes a defective system which generates temporary and then permanent injuries as a specific connection to that activity, which requires the rehabilitation system to address at the point that the sedition ends and the laws enforced against the abusers, who, being abusers, are doing the trick on purpose for its negative consequences by compelling them by coercion into compliance. And the coerced compliance of the obligations is, in fact, rape, theft, or otherwise. And in that action requires the complete redistribution of the profits from the rape culture back to the victims plus the additional liabilities. And thus, the remedy to the secret is essential to the ending of the rape culture, and the refusal to do so is aiding and abetting the tool of the rape culture for their own ends, including the subjugation of the credible threats against the judges, who then would normally be threatened along with the politicians in order to comply with the white supremacists which have taken over the executive and are ignoring the president and the hierarchy as it is their enemy government and not their perceived hierarchy. The cancel culture is derivative of the radicalization process, similar to the Muslim terrorists who were radicalized by the white supremacists, who will in the future be consumed similar because they are the same type of product. The cancel culture promoters will be consumed like the Muslim terrorists. Whoever you want to know who our enemies are going to be in the future, you have to look at who our allies or who we're supporting right now. The function of having supported them is the act of the radicalization, is the ritual activity or schedule for their sacrifice and consumption. The psychopaths engaged in the communist activities of the cancel culture, of the obstruction of the contracts of the general community so that they can restructure society in their image as a fake majority, engages in that activity which maintains their own demise. It is clever until it turns on them. In the function of Frazu Bulu, the use of their activities in these ritual activities becomes the normalization which allows them in their delusion to be subjugated to the illusion, which they then are accelerated as the false religion and whatever religion that they think that they're serving in that radicalization by the infection is mutated by the editing. And in the lore for the demon lord, those who accept being sacrificed as a replacement to the distraction sacrifice are then put into a position where they are sent to an illusion realm that looks like their version of heaven until the illusion wears off and they realize what they've done as they're being eaten. And that is the function which has been normalized in the history of the communist objectives and state realization of the psychopathic delusion for the white supremacists in charge of the KKK contracts for their white supremacist superiority or their wizards of light generate the illusion of their superiority, nobility, or legitimacy from the system of the illusions. And those who consistently lie big enough, often enough, become delusional. And the act of traumatizing the general public with that activity is the ritual spell in order to overthrow the majority vote until they subject themselves to the delusion. And thus in Revelation it says that if the times were not shortened, that even the elect would fall to the great delusion. There's a strong delusion. It's the self-induced function or intoxication by the sorcery to submit to the magic as the anarchical form of government, as the function of their worship from their state-established religion. The liars lie, and thus the position from the white supremacist communists engage in the function of accusing people in their struggling sessions for the purpose of capturing them at the point of the harassment, breaking the person's psyche, gets the person to accept their place under the harassment so that they then become whatever they're harassed about, which is actually the normal social behavior of the ones who are harassing them. As people who participate in it, they are experts in what the thing is, so they know what to say in the harassment because they know how they behave. And so it's normal to them, and so they can describe it properly. And thus they accuse people of the thing that they're guilty of. And in the action of doing so, engage in the harassment until the person breaks down and accepts the lie from the abuse into the position of becoming delusional. accepting the lie is delusion, and in that activity then become captured and serve the function of the wizards who were abusing them, and in that abusive relationship may be discarded as expendable at any arbitrary time. So, in that position, they would create a mechanism so that they could uh, pretend to oppose the subject that they would be referring to in the struggling sessions or harassment arrangements when they have full control of the party, at which point uh, whoever is actively looking for excessive powers against the limitations of the law and constitution, specifically referring to the superior law having barred them from the action, is the precedent, and thus the overthrowing of the rule of law becomes the action. And in the action of the precedent, for the false justification of destroying the fake subjects, you have the war on drugs distributed by the premier distributors of narcotics in the first place. And thus, in that action, you create an impossible conflict to win, as the party assigned to winning are in fact the fundamental part of the scheme, and thus you have parties from the local police and sheriffs who are then convinced by those parties, such as the CIA, who say that it's beyond your pay grade to arrest uh, your targets in your jurisdictions, which is your job. At which point, the confidence game is the creation of the delusion for the struggling session. The police officer is obligated to make the arrest. The sheriff is obligated to make the arrest. It is legal for them to have undermined that activity, but the action of ignoring it specifically becomes the function of the demonstration that the magic is working, that the wizard has in fact captured the mechanism, and in that action create the permanent sense of the superiority for the anarchy against the rule of law. And in the action of having captured the function of the fake opposition to whatever distraction subjects, insert war on drugs or whatever you want to, insert war on words, whatever, generates the pretense of permanent rackets, which is a RICO violation. It is a racketeering operation. They are a criminal mafia operation. This is prohibited behavior, engages in the ongoing process, where the act of having prosecuted and abused people and created risk for the subject is the mechanism which increase the cost of business, which increase the price for the thing as they launder the subject, at which point they can increase it exponentially by being more aggressive, which is the endorsement for the product and not its opposition. They are artificially raising from their centrally planned economy the value of the product, at which point it becomes more profitable. And they can, from the position of having captured the law enforcement mechanism, allow for their sales to go through for the consumption of the resources for their non congressionally approved of paycheck, as they have undermined Congress's power of the purse, and in that activity become the permanent racket for their power, generating their superiority in that mechanism as above the law. And in the United States, the rule of law is the functional authority, and thus the mechanism of being above the law is being above the United States, is an act of insurrection. And they, engaging in the insurrection, have engaged in war against the Constitution and are guilty of treason, are guilty of sedition, are guilty of high crimes, and must be arrested as an act of national security. Thus, the function of national security requires them to be purged from the system, nullifying the wizard's advantage in their anarcho-communist state. So this then proves the danger of the false moralizer, as the false moralizer says that the constitutional republic is for moral people and is completely useless for any other kind, when the promotion of their particular morals is in question, which is a part of the delusion as opposed to the collective position where the act of integrity and discipline become the status quo, whereas the actual morality from discipline is the thing that conducts the normal activities of law enforcement without the corruption, and thus the incorruptibility is the morality that is actually referred to in the quote that they are misquoting when promoting their false morality as a function to engage in the overthrow of the state for the state religion, and the engagement of that false morality is the thing that they're guilty of, and thus is the thing to be racketeered, and thus the thing promoted by their opposition, and thus the thing funding the wizards threatening the public under the communist arrangement for the hate group led society, which was reproduced again in the Middle East when creating the terrorist organizations, which generates the pretense of turning them from freedom fighters into terrorists, where they are then processed into being consumed. And thus, the mechanism of having overthrown the democracies and established dictatorships is derivative of the white supremacists' fundamental incapability of generating a stable society. They, in their experiments in government, have proven that they are not capable of forming a government, and in their delusion become self-inoculated by the position of if you build it, they will come, generates the position of they it will work with them because it has to work with them, which is a delusional position. Their capacity as a business owner would fundamentally fail on these pretenses of their specific types of psychopathy, which generates their own act of national suicide, as they themselves understand that their systems are incapable of working while they are pushing for it to be the only option, which means there is collective international tragedy when the system collapses, creating the major turmoil, creating the function of their service to Satan in the one world Luciferian religion for the revelation one world government, when they create the world tragedies for revelation and destroy the world, creating the need for their satanic one world government, at which point they are the gimmick. Those pushing for these precedents in the violation of law and order are the gimmick. Their active economic destabilizing functions are the gimmick. The deconstruction of the economy is the gimmick. The function of promoting the violations of the law by a false pretense is the gimmick. Perdition is their society. The assertion of the Wizards of Light is derivative of genetic guilt, which is commonly referred to as racism, at which point the position of the hyper-radicalization of the satanic religion, acknowledging God's position that all men are born sinners because Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, generates the pretense of collective guilt, and the enforcement against the collective guilt by the war efforts is collective punishment for the collective guilt of having been human, and thus the act of being human becomes the act of violation, creating the obligation to punishment, which is the justification of the mass sacrifice in part. And to this extent, you have the progress of the offenders in the factions of the Confederacy, which generates their opposition to each other, which understands that on maturity the anarchists will engage in the Civil War one way or another. So anyone who says that we can't fight them because civil war is anarchy, is hell, is fundamentally not understanding the position. The existence of the Confederacy is the state of civil war, is the state of purging themselves, similar to in um, such as the Invincibles with the Volturims engaged in the Civil War in order to assert who is the strongest, and thus instigating the position of the different civil war on the basis of the difference between their druid leaders, saying that one is for conquest as an empire and the other is for stopping the function of expansion as an empire. Um, the existence of that type of society is the act itself of that type of civil war that you would be avoiding in order to engage in law enforcement to protect the United States and its allies from that society, at which point the argument nullifies itself upon any actual investigation, requiring the acknowledgement of the thing. As the conversation progresses, the other parties generically become to understand or are aware of at a specific moment, a flint, a sparkle in their eye as they begin to unravel in their own minds the fact that they are starting to get the process of their mistake, where they fell for the illusion in order to protect the scam artists. And in that action, you have the inevitability of their obligation to submit to the reason or to double down in that moment to their delusion, as their religious fervor and loyalty to the delusion is the white supremacist core idealism, as rationality does not tolerate the existence of the racism, which is foundless, baseless, and irrational in every sense, such as the racist position that um, brain sizes are different, and so some technicality, scientific jargon bullshit. The thing has been examined and the function is fraudulent. Every aspect of the eugenics function with its pseudoscience engages in the acknowledgement of self-delusion. It's all fraud, it's all scams, it's all nonsense. They don't actually have any competent position. They have something that is an alluring attraction or narrative to some that's entertaining enough to make them fall for it if they're dumb enough to fall for it. Otherwise, the position is whether or not they are radicalized after those who were dumb enough to fall for it become subjugated to. And thus the mechanism of the Confederates having funded the creation of the Nazis has standardized the action of the Nazi position of not smelling their own farts, as the position is to lie big and lie often enough until their illusion becomes the collective delusion. And in that action of state mandated delusion, you forfeit your very identity. Now, in this position, you have the collective idea of that delusion, which generates in the satanic religion for I think it was Balaam, who tricked the Israelis into sacrificing to idols and having sex with foreign women, who tricked them into the position where they were no longer blessed by God, requiring the Levites to be formed into God's priesthood in the slaughtering of those who made that violation, which creates the ritual sacrifice mechanism common to the white supremacists in this arrangement. Now, many pastors and others have said that God's graces are beyond, limitation, and thus it is impossible for you to sell your soul to the devil. which is objectively wrong. And I need you, for your soul's sake, to understand this, that God gives the strong delusion after you reject reality too much time. At a certain point, you spurn the Holy Spirit in favor of the benefits of the deals with the devils. Having renounced the position of reason, having spurned the Holy Spirit in favor of the benefits from the devils, you have sold in that ritual action, according to the Bible, holistically and completely your soul, which no longer exists. At that point, such as the position of Pharaoh refusing to let Israel go, it happened time and time and time and time again. His deal with the devil became reinforced so many times that at some point God gave him to the position, and the action of the ritual is making them go through that process. The person who is targeted has to accept being guilty by the struggling session, and in the action of accepting guilt as a core part of their identity, they spurn the Holy Spirit, they sell their soul, and they become incapable of change. There are people who are functionally material right now, today, who are beyond saving on the basis of their devotion to the delusion in service of the hate crimes, which has profited them exponentially by the thefts from the white supremacists, engaging in the white supremacist communism. And at that point, the central planned economy has promised them generational wealth, which is functionally a lie like everything they peddle, at which point the acceptance of the delusion on purpose, on the false promises, is the action of having sold their soul, is the action of being devoted to the devils, is the action of having registered themselves as a commissioned product for the person that sold them to the devils. And you need to understand that the historic arguments of their terrorism layered fraud and scams. So take, for instance, the position of the original white supremacist position of expansion by manifest destiny. They promised everyone a bunch of land in the expansion, and they blocked those that were guilty of being the wrong type of person or not white. And in that engagement, you compel the legal correction obligation to provide the equivalent to the others who were owed equal access to those intergenerational positions in the claiming of the land from those policies. And then in the action of the corrections, they say that, you should go off of preferred who's better at it over who, whatever the gimmick is. But in fact, the whoever's better at it was the original position from when the white supremacists created the first violation, making it an obligation not of the social construct for the general free market, but a legal remedy by a judicial order from the legal theory that the rule of law is to be sustained. And thus, in that action, they nullify their own construct. Um, as the pendulum swings both ways and they seek to dodge it, the obligation to protect yourself requires you to bind them as the pendulum swings so that they could be knocked off by it. Not allowing them to dodge it is fundamental to purging yourself of the white supremacist stain on the United States for having tolerated their existence. And in that action, you generate the systems of repairing all of their various frauds, which have protected their historic crimes, such as the position of having conducted the violation and protecting the wealth from the theft against the law, which is from a previous generation, and the position of it being a previous generation or too long ago in order to do is fraudulent on its face, as the act of having done it in the first place restrains the function of the government by the sedition, restrains the parties who would receive the benefit from receiving the benefit. And in the act of restraining them, they created delay and an expansion, and expanding the position of when they have to file it on the basis of the restraints is continued and laundered, similar to the function of how to avoid taxation by the changing of titles, creates the illusion by the ritual process of having laundered the money into permanent wealth by the theft. And in that action, you engage in a structure where you acknowledge the theft in the beginning, and you acknowledge that the transfer is illegitimate, as the action of laundering the stolen resources is prohibited by the law itself. You have a degree of continuation of the crime by aiding and abetting, and the action of continuing to aid and abet after the fact creates an aiding and abetting during the fact, which creates an aiding and abetting before the fact, as a plan for the continuation in the laundering, and accepting your place in the continuation of that laundering is aiding and abetting the collective offense of the white supremacist communism in order to launder the stolen goods into that mechanism, which is a modern day offense consistently reinforced by the guilty parties who are engaged in the laundering mechanism. And that requires immediate modern remedies. But those modern remedies cannot be conducted without the function of the government, which is being restrained by their sedition, which is the purpose of their modern day sedition. And so their targeting of David Bowles as the patriarchy is the stopping of the aristocracy from forming the Congress and the Senate. And to this extent, you generate the ability to protect the infection by its manipulation of the president, by barring the Senate created by that aristocracy, to stop the impeachment process as they engage in the fraudulent laundering of the pretense of the right of the president to commit a crime in his being tricked by the false position of unitary executive theory of the executive being above the other branches, which breaks the constitutional obligation to checks and balances, which states that the president specifically does not have authority over the other branches, and thus the use of the secrets in order to undermine that mechanism is the engagement of treason by insurrection. And in that disqualifies the right of the president, compelling the Senate to engage in the impeachment and all of the other processes from whichever law enforcement mechanism is able to do it. They all have their own separate processes. And in the object of restraining David, you prevent him from forming the Senate, which allows the replaced Senate with the Confederates to refuse to engage in the impeachment, as they are a part of the insurrection, which proves that they are barred from being in the Senate. And in that action, you prove that the United States is not run by the American government or constitutional republic, it is run by its adversaries, which are all aiding and abetting, and having known better, are continuing on purpose to perpetuate the offenses as a status function of their agreement as a double agent. There is no sovereign immunity for the insurrection. The insurrection is specifically the thing that bars them. They are specifically prohibited from the action. The law cannot protect them from the thing that it said that they can't do, and so their violation is an attack on the law, is the thing that bars them. They are an enemy of the United States, which is the reason they refuse on purpose to acknowledge David according to his original title from their records, which they are doing as an act of sedition to overthrow the government. To this extent, the function of necessary precautions in order to stop an offense means that if someone is grossly negligent and a crime happens as a result, um, then by definition, uh, there is less the government is able to do about it because of their own misbehavior. And thus, the mechanism required the existence of their submission to David's um, legend company, which generates the zombie insurance, which is the necessary precautions, and thus the mechanism of all of the other systems that they were avoiding um, from being successful would have been the con version of the same thing. And thus the mechanism requires them to have submitted to um, creating the mechanism of David's systems as the patriarchy, which is acknowledged in the record of the memories from the Lookingglass when engaging in the manipulation, trying to defraud it by their biases. When looking at the estimate of the non-obstructed version of David Bowles and Don Bowles and the rest of them, engages in that structure which builds the legend companies, which creates the insurance structures, which is the necessary precautions, which generates the historic positions, as anyone who is engaged in the function of looking for the advantage has to go to it and then invest ahead of time in order to have been an early investor, and thus the government is obligated to have told them at the necessary time, which puts it all the way back to the beginning when they were begging for the same thing. And when they're begging for the thing, they don't care what the thing is as long as it's the real thing, which is David Bowles' network structures and his zombie insurance structures and the rest of the systems in the obstructed companies, which would have been provided as the outcry was generated. To this extent, you have the original market from the free market, where they were engaging in the necessary precautions in order to have not suffered the injury, which would have provided them the protections, which provides the corrections by the law, not manipulated by the white supremacists, giving the false hope as distractions and expiring their claims, defrauding them into the poverty as they are socially engineered into self acknowledged inferiority by the struggling sections from their racist, white supremacist, communist plantation owners. Historically, the KKK was derivative from the Democrat Party, and in many of those cases, they engage in the anarcho-communism terrorist operations against the black community. And in the cases where the Republicans tried to free the blacks or engage in the subversion of the spells by the Confederates, the Democrats would engage in the KKK activities against the white Republicans who were challenging their spell, violating the anarcho rule of there are no rules, and thus the challenging of the wizard is the violation of their policy, and the assertion that there is some kind of rule of law is the subjugation of the wizard and the disillusionment of their magic. Threatening their core identity as scam artists, they do not have a mechanism to survive in nature without that magic, and the disillusionment of the magic is an attack on their self identity's ability to exist in reality, as it is and has always been entirely reliant on their delusion and their capacity to compel their delusion onto others, such as the delusion from the government, which is cooperated by many mechanisms to engage in the harassment of children by the female narcissists in order to convert their children into trans by trickery, um, as they've been captured by the surveillance systems in the kidnapping structures, which generates their connection of the white supremacists from the federal government and military and the state of California, amongst others, which engages in the laundering of the sex change mechanisms of those children by the surveillance structures, where they are tricked into saying the thing or overpowered by it, such as the FBI's voice control powers, such as found in Friendly Fascism, where the surveillance is able to target the person and the nerve hacking compels the action not only just to control the body and but also the voice box. So you have compelled speech by the surveillance structure, which gets the false testimony laundering the confession of the minor who has no control over that system, which then says that they are trans, which then gets the government involved into the transitional care, which then neuters the child in the compelled transition in the service of their satanic religion, including the Canaanite religion with Ishtar, where they have the religious compulsion of neutering the boys, which continues in the mechanism of their educational system as they engage in these religious acts from their state established religion, loyal to Satan. And again, these are abusive communist struggling tactics. They engage in the harassment, they engage in the struggling, they capture the target, they engage in the manipulation by the ritual, and they launder their hate crimes through those ritual activities. In D&D lore, there is a creature with one eye which radiates negative necrotic energies, and it, with its one eye and its humanoid shape, used to be a person, a person who attempted to reinforce their powers through the same mechanisms that Vecna attempted in his mass human sacrifice systems. And these deformed abominations are actively the functional future of the white supremacist wizards in the D&D variant of their function. So if there was a D&D session, their inevitable future would be to fall into that trap, as the Vecna in question would have created security mechanisms to guarantee that their access to the resources would make them fail the rituals, which does not stop the mass sacrifices, but merely reinforces Vecna's absorption of the negative energy, as the dumbfounded fools engaged in the deal with the devils in order to progress their power are misdirected systemically into their own collapse and are the cause of their own demise by their own hands, by their own foolishness, by their insanity. They have acquired undeath. And in this action, in the pursuit of significance, become the overlooked monster. They transform into their very own Nothic.